In nomine Patri, Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. So let's continue reading and reflecting on an introduction to the life of devotion by St. Francis de Sales. Many say that they leave mental prayer to the perfect, and that they are not worthy to practice it. Others protest that they dare not communicate often because they do not think themselves pure enough. Others that they fear to disgrace devotion if they meddle with it because of their great misery and weakness. And others refuse to employ their talents in the service of God and of their neighbours, because, so they say, they know their feebleness and are afraid of becoming proud. If they are instruments of any good, and of being consumed themselves, whilst they are enlightening others. All this is but artifice, and a kind of humility which is not only false, but evil, whereby they seek tacitly and subtly to find fault with the things of God, or, at all events, to conceal, under a pretext of humility, the love of their own opinion, of their own inclination, and of their own slothfulness. So that was quite a long one, but there's a lot obviously being said there. We're carrying over this theme of spiritual pride that we looked at quite a lot in the last session. And this character of someone who says, no, all of these things of sainthood and devotion and perfection, they're all too good for me. I'm not really right for them. How dare someone as small and weak and, if you like, as humble as myself dare to involve myself in all of these kinds of things? Now, again, the subtlety, the reason why it's subtle pride is because it gives the semblance of being humble at the face of it and saying, well, I've got such reverence for these things that I don't want to engage in them in case my own abilities will make me prideful. But that's not really for you to say. Well, not really. It's not for you to say, as we've already covered. God wants all of us to live the life of devotion and to be on that path. To say that we're not good enough for it is to say that in that sense we know better than God. We know better what our purpose should actually be. And we know better what our place is as well, right? Now, God knows better than we do how lowly and small we are. But then we're using that as an excuse of saying, therefore, we shouldn't be on the path to perfection, which is actually where he thinks our place should be. Very interesting. I mean, here's another example of this same problem, but in a different context. The same mistake is made by a person who despairs of God's mercy and his forgiveness. And they say, I know that I'm such a wicked and evil person that God could not possibly forgive me. How could I ever possibly ask for his mercy? And therefore I'm not going to. It's not right for me to do so. And again, it has that flair of like humble justice to it, where you say, well, the person recognizes their lowliness and their awfulness so much that they understand just what they're asking for. But on the other hand, no, they don't, because they're also showing a distinct lack of faith in God's goodness and his mercy. That is in fact a sin, right? We are supposed to trust in God's mercy and his goodness. And so if we take that judgment upon ourselves and say, well, he might say that he can forgive all sinners no matter how badly they have trespassed, he can still wipe away their sins. He might say that, but I'm ultimately not going to believe it because my own opinion is in some way greater. Even my own opinion of my own smallness is greater than his word, that he can look past that and still put me on the life of perfection. Okay, that's where the twist comes in. Again, it gives that appearance of humility to some degree, but actually it's pride, because you're in reality saying that your opinion of your status your actions, your deeds, your worthiness, your opinion of that is actually better and more sound and more true than what God has said. Many say that they leave mental prayer to the perfect. Let's focus on that idea of leaving things to the perfect for a second there. I suppose the only thing I'd really want to say, or the only thing that really comes to mind, is the fact that falling short of perfection is no excuse. One of the things that came to mind was the idea that a lot of people I speak to within the church, we rightly agree amongst each other that given how flawed we are, we would be lucky to get into purgatory, right? We all hope we're not going to go to hell, indeed. But none of us clearly expect that we're going to go to heaven either. Not really. It seems purgatory is probably the more likely option, and we would be quite lucky to go to purgatory. Now, here's the thing. Does that mean that we should therefore aim for purgatory? No. That in itself would actually be a sin as well. We have to. Not it's not a case of should we, no, sorry, it's not a case of if we were good enough, would we? We actually have to aim for heaven. That is what we're supposed to do. That's our moral duty, is to aim for nothing less than perfection. If we only aim for purgatory, even if that's the more reasonable or the more likely place that we're going to end up, if we only aim for purgatory, that is again that same subtle sin of pride, right? Of saying, I know that God actually wants me to be perfect, but my opinion of myself is so clear that I'm only going to aim for second best, right? Um, so the idea is to aim as high as possible. And then you might say, okay, even though I do, maybe I will only reach the target underneath it. Okay. But that's not the same then as putting your aim down and actually aiming for that target underneath it, right? God demands that we be perfect, that we aspire to be perfect, that we be as good as we can, and that all of our intentions go towards that. And to aim for anything less is actually a insult to his plans and his intentions. So we can't use that as an excuse. We can't use our faults as an excuse in that way. In summary, we can't use our faults as an excuse not to aim for perfection, because that would actually be pride. So St. Francis continues, "Oh, the wretched man! He makes a pretense of showing great reverence to God, and under colour of humility, he excuses himself from aspiring to the grace to which the divine goodness invites him." Right? We are being invited by God. And to say, no, we're not worthy is not respect to him, it is actually an insult, right? To recognize that in our current state we are falling short of perfection is all right, it goes without saying. But to say, no, you've invited me to the banquet, but I'm just not going to come because I don't think I'm good enough. It's, no, but you were invited. You should go. If you need to be better dressed by the time you get there, yeah, that's like the whole difficulty. But that's not an excuse not to go. Um, and then there was another thing he said in the passage before, sorry, where he kind of said this is also an excuse. So it shows love of one's own opinion, but it also shows a level of slothfulness as well, a level of laziness, right? If you can say, I'm too wretched to aim at perfection, okay, great. Now you've taken that task away from you. You've justified to yourself that you don't need to do that anymore. And so it actually allows you to be, slothful before that duty and to ignore it and to forsake it. So now St. Francis is talking about the balance that is actually brought out by genuine humility. He says, I have no wish either to play the fool or to play the wise man. For if humility prevents me from playing the wise man, simplicity and sincerity will likewise prevent me from playing the fool. And if vanity is contrary to humility, artifice, affectation, and dissimulation are contrary to sincerity and simplicity. Humility, artifice, affection, and dissimulation are contrary to sincerity and simplicity. And if some great servants of God have pretended to be fools in order to render themselves more abject in the eyes of the world, we should admire them, but not imitate them. For they have had motives for proceeding to this excess, which have been so personal and extraordinary that no one ought to draw any conclusions therefrom for himself. So that last bit of the passage is basically saying there are some things that great people have done, saints have done, which have they resulted from the very particular excesses of their lives, which they've had to correct. But the main thing he was saying here is, I wish neither to play the fool nor the wise man. For if humility prevents me from playing the wise man, simplicity and sincerity will likewise prevent me from playing the fool, right? False humility is not a virtue. To say that you're stupid when you're intelligent is not a virtue. To say that you're weak when you're strong is not a virtue. And again, to say that you are a fool when you are in fact a wise man is not a virtue. It's not genuine humility, because it flies in the face of sincerity and honesty. That's an affront to the truth, right? And that might sound, again, it sounds like a contradiction to a binary mind, but it's not a contradiction. You can, on the one hand, say, I am intelligent, but then still be humble enough to say, I could be more intelligent, right? I'm not as intelligent as other people. I am certainly not anywhere near as intelligent as God, right? So that's what humility calls for. It's like if you imagine God being a mountain and then you are, say, 6 foot. To say that you are therefore 2 foot is a lie, right? It's an affront to the truth. No, you are in fact 6 foot tall. But to say that you're the tallest person in the world or the tallest thing in the world and nothing is greater than you and ultimately you're the one who is the standard of height itself, that is pride and arrogance, right? So humility also involves that you recognize what value and virtue you have to its proper degree, right? Don't overinflate it, but be clear about it. And again, be simple and sincere about what those values and virtues are. Yeah. I think this passage really illuminates something important about humility. There is a difference between the virtue of humility and abjection. For abjection is the littleness, loneliness, and insignificance that is in us without our thinking of it. But as to the virtue of humility, it is the true knowledge and voluntary acknowledgement of our abjection, right? So we have that abjection in us, but sometimes we're not aware of it. But when we not only recognize it, but embrace it, that is humility. Now, the highest point of this humility is not only voluntarily to acknowledge our abjection, but to love it and to take pleasure in it. Not from any lack of courage and generosity, but to exalt so much the more the divine majesty, and to esteem our neighbor the more in comparison with ourselves. So the main takeaway from this passage was that first of all, we recognize again how destitute, weak, limited, lowly, wretched we are, in fact, by the divine measure of things. So that's the first step. And then we embrace it, love the fact, and in fact, take pleasure in it. What on earth could that mean, right? How would you possibly be able to take pleasure in such a thing? And again, towards the end of the passage, he said to exalt the divine majesty and the magnitude of the people around us. And that is the main point. Humility is actually enjoyable, and pride is actually a miserable state to be in. I think I was able to speak to this a little bit in the last session, but just to kind of go over it again. Pride tries to shrink everything else around you and make it small, right? And in many ways makes it contemptible as well, right? So in terms of ego, if you like, you can imagine a proud person standing in a group of people, and the more proud he is, the more he inflates himself until he becomes a giant standing above all of them. Yeah. Now, in that case, what's the opinion? What are those people like to that giant? How enjoyable are they to be around? Well, they're not very enjoyable to be around at all. They're only that small, right? They don't say anything that's of any interest. They can't touch him in any genuine way, right? They are just like flies around his apparent uh, his apparent majesty. Yeah. So he has these little trivial things that he has to interact with on a daily basis that have nothing interesting to say, that have no real value to them, and kind of fall under his radar, right? And so they become, at best, trivial, but at worst, a nuisance as well. They can affect his life and that kind of thing. So that's the state of the prideful man. Now, what about the humble man, right? So instead of being inflated above this crowd, where they all become small, insignificant, and even irritating, he now shrinks down, and these people around him, because of his own humility, their value becomes magnified, right? And they become much larger. And now you think, wow, this person is surrounded by giants, and the giants' voices are much louder, and they're much more interesting to listen to. They have so much more to say. Indeed, so much more to say than this little man underneath them might have to say. Theirs is actually worth more. Their features and the aspects of them and who they are is magnified and becomes clearer, right? And so they're much more impressive to him, and they're much larger, right? And now they're the kind of beings that can make him stand in amazement, right? That interaction is much more enjoyable. That experience of the humble man who is surrounded by these wonderful giants is much more enjoyable than the prideful man who is surrounded by a bunch of trivial flies, right? I think that's the illustration I'm trying to give, um, and so that's why embracing your abjection and embracing your littleness, right, putting yourself in that frame of mind of being small, allows you to look up in wonder at God, at the world around you, and of the other people as well. The smaller you get in comparison to them in your own mind, then the larger their qualities become to you. You actually see their values drawn out. And isn't it more enjoyable to be around people who have genuine value that you admire and that you appreciate? Isn't it more enjoyable to be in a world where the things around you are, you see them for the gift that they are, and you see yourself in relation to that? Um, you see the majesty, the awe, and the wonder that you're always surrounded with. Um, that is the truth at the end of the day as well. That is the truth that is the case. And the diabolical thing about it is pride simply blinds us to that. It doesn't make the opposite true. It simply blinds us to the fact that we are surrounded by such goodness. And so that's why it's a pleasure. It can be a pleasure to be humble. And just one passage here to bring our attention back to how humble our Lord was. Ah, who will give us the grace to be able to say with the great King, I have chosen to be an abject in the house of God rather than to dwell in the tabernacles of sinners. No one can do it, dear Philothea, but he who, to exalt us, so lived and died that he was the reproach of men and an abject among the people. Indeed. This is quite interesting. He's now speaking about the relationship between humility and reputation, which will be called a good name. Okay. He says, now, since humility cannot permit us to have any desire of excelling or of being preferred to others, it cannot permit us to seek for praise, honour, or glory which are due to excellence alone. Yet, humility readily falls in with the counsel of the wise man, who admonishes us to take care of a good name. And just to check, I think that's from Ecclesiastes. Okay. Because a good name is an esteem, not of some excellence, but only of a plain and ordinary uprightness and integrity of life. And humility does not prevent us from recognizing this in ourselves, nor in consequence from desiring the reputation for such. It is true that humility would despise a good name if charity had no need thereof. But because it is one of the foundations of human society, and because without it we are not only useless but hurtful to society, by reason of the scandal which it receives thereby, charity requires, and humility assents, that we should desire a good name and carefully preserve it. Very, very interesting. You see where the spiritual instruction falls straight in line with the practicalities of societal life, right? He's saying there's nothing against humility. We shouldn't just look and farm our own exaltation, right? We shouldn't try and pull up as many praises and glories and honors as we can just for the sake of them. But he's also saying a reputation isn't a bad thing. A good reputation isn't a bad thing if you're functioning well in a decent society, right? And indeed, if you don't have a good reputation, that might damage your ability to function well, function effectively, and even effectively again for God in that society, right? So if you're a police officer, for example, and you're trying to uphold the justice, but you get a reputation for being crooked or conniving or scandalous, and indeed, if those things aren't true, then that is something you really should fight against. That part of your honor you really should protect. Because if you are not trusted as a police officer, you cannot do your duty properly. You cannot protect people and uphold the justice as well as you otherwise could do. So in that sense, your reputation is tied in to your duty. And for you to uphold your duty as much as possible, your reputation really should be maintained. And so there's nothing against humility to, again, hold on to the values that you have and recognize the decent set of value that you have. False humility is not a virtue. And so if someone is trying to cultivate scandal or defame you unjustly and are trying to spread a bad name about you, you are completely within your right to rail and fight against that with truth, right? And likewise, you shouldn't just tarnish your own reputation, your own good name, for the sake of humility. That, from what he's explaining, would be to miss the point. Yeah. Recognize your own abjection and your lowliness in the cosmic scheme of things, but to the extent that you are in fact functioning well in society and contributing to it, recognize that and uphold that accordingly. He also says, excessive fear of losing a good name indicates a great distrust of its foundation, which is the truth of a good life. Excessive fear of losing a good name. Okay. So yeah, don't be in excessive fear of losing your reputation. In fact, that's probably a sign that you're not quite confident in its foundations. So be wary of that as well. He that wishes to have a good name with all, who wishes to have a good reputation with all, loses it with all. That is definitely true. You can't please all the people all the time, as they might say. And the reason for that is because then you are going to be inauthentic, basically. And both justice and goodness, well, they're the same thing, but that they require authenticity. If you try and appease a corrupt person and a just person at the same time, then that appeasement is going to be as corrupt as it is just, and the whole thing becomes tainted, right? So trying to uphold your reputation with every single person, people will understand that then you're pursuing reputation for reputation's own sake, right? And that's where you've got to understand it in its proper context. You're not upholding reputation for reputation's sake. You're upholding reputation for the sake of functioning well in society in order to serve God, goodness, beauty, truth, and justice, right? That's the point. Again, like you said, if your station doesn't require that at all, right, then it wouldn't actually be a concern. But because most people's station in society does, then it is a concern. Again, so you have to put reputation in its proper context, right? If you try and pursue reputation for reputation's own sake, such that you try to be liked by everyone and to have a good reputation by everyone, how to explain this succinctly unless it's already understood? All I'm going to say is I think we all understand the person who has too many faces, right? We understand how disgusting that is. Um, they don't actually have their own genuine, authentic, honest, therefore, personality, and therefore not living by the truth. Because you'll have 10 different opinions on a given street, and all of those opinions will in fact conflict and contradict each other. But this person will wear all 10 of those opinions, not because he actually believes any of them, but simply because he wants everyone else to like him. Right? So he becomes serpentine as a result. And I think we all intuitively know that. Although our good name be cut away, or even shaved away, although altogether by the tongue of slanderers, which, as David says, is like a sharp razor, we should not be disquieted, for soon it will spring up again, and will be not only as beautiful as before, but even more solidly established. The root of a good name is goodness and probity, and so long as this root remains in us, it can always regain the honour which is due to it. Okay, so you can imagine your reputation as being like a flower, and when slander and scandal, untrue, unjust slander and scandal comes along and shaves away the flowers and the leaves, you think, okay, it's no longer on show for the time being. People have forgotten or lost that it's actually there. But so long as that root stays in place, so long as you are in fact a good, honest, and truthful person, it will become clear that that was always the case, right? Maybe it becomes clear later on that your slanderers were in fact exactly that, that you were defamed unjustly, but you were still able to keep your goodness and integrity in place. From that, the flower of your good reputation will grow again. And indeed, people appreciate it all the more and see its vibrancy all the more clearly, precisely because it was able to withstand the damage, yeah, and because it was consistent. It wasn't a plastic flower that you could shave away and then it would just disappear. It was a genuine flower of goodness, which, despite the fact that it was cut down, grew again. So if you know that that's the case, then you can have peace. But again, you can only know that if you recognize, to a degree, your own value, whilst recognizing your own objection. So, have to try and keep all of these things in mind at once. The moral dimension is not contradictory, but it is complex and multifaceted. If we are blamed unjustly, Let us peaceably set forth the truth against the calumny. If the calumny perseveres, let us persevere in humility. We do justice to truth by upholding it when it's threatened or when it's spoken against. But at the end of the day, we can't force people's minds, right? If they're going to continue with the slander and continue believing the falsities, despite the fact that we've told the truth, it will have to be. We're now moving on to a different topic. St. Francis says, "No wrathful man ever thinks that his wrath is unjust." There's a lot more to say about the topic of anger. It's a complicated one in Catholicism. It's very complicated. Because there is such a thing as righteous or divine or justified anger. We are, for example, told that God has wrath, right? And because God is goodness himself, wrath itself cannot be by nature bad or evil. But at the same time, that is not an excuse for us to use it unwittingly. No wrathful man ever thinks his wrath is unjust. So there are times when anger is indeed justified. In fact, anger is usually a reaction to injustice, right? That is when it's mostly justified. And our Lord chased people out of the temple with whips in his own frustration at their unjust actions. However, we have to use a very careful level of moral discernment to distinguish anger from wrath. In my limited understanding, I think the difference is that wrath, as opposed to anger, or even anger that you use to fight, because fighting is a part of Catholicism and Christianity as well, for sure. But wrath has this malicious element to it, where that anger is no longer fuel for upholding the good, but it's now actually becoming a tool for genuine destruction. And what I mean by that is moral destruction, right? So again, Christian love, agape, charity, is all about loving someone for the sake of their good, right? And anger can actually work along with this. If you see your one child hitting another unjustly, or lying to another, or manipulating another one, you getting angry at that is actually for the good of all of your children, right? By showing that that action is really wrong and impressing that upon your children, right? So in that sense, it's for the good. But if you use anger for the worsening of someone, that is when you could probably call it wrath, right? So in your anger, you might see a man committing fraud and brazenly lying to a bunch of innocent people. And in your anger, you might be inflamed by that and tell him exactly how you feel and berate him extremely for what he's done. But in your wrath, to let him know what he's done so that he knows right from wrong as clearly as you can possibly impress upon him. And you might do some other stuff as well. But in your wrath, you might, say, attack the man's children, right? Knowing that it's going to hurt him, but also by stepping out of line with justice. I think that's the whole idea, right? So if it was simply anger, you would bring the hammer of justice down upon the man himself and let him know that his actions were wrong. But out of wrath, maybe you would coax him into sin in some way, or in this case, you would actually be committing sin yourself by, say, taking the injustice out on his children, right, who are innocent in the matter. So that's one way to understand the difference between wrath and justice. Anyway, I've taken a long digression from the actual passage itself. The passage was, no wrathful man ever thinks that his wrath unjust. That's the key thing, right? So a wrathful man will always justify his wrath, right? So if you do then go and attack this fraudster and kill his children, for example, you might justify it in some way by saying, well, they were always going to grow up to be just like their father anyway, or he should have thought about that before he tried to commit all of those sins, or something like that. Justice demands that this damage doesn't only hurt him, but it spills out onto everyone he knows as well. That's the way to justify it, right? So you're making it in line with justice. So again, you've got to have really careful moral discernment to know where the anger is appropriate and where the line between anger and the Christian battle is drawn, aside from wrath. We now on to another topic again. Many commit a great fault who, when they have given way to anger, are annoyed at having been annoyed, are vexed at having been vexed, and at having fretted, for by this means they have kept their hearts preserved and steeped in anger. And although the second anger may seem to destroy the first, yet it serves as an opening and a passage for a new anger. Excuse me. That's quite funny in its own way. It's not really, but it has this nice ironic twist to it. We get angry about being angry. We get worried about worrying. Yeah. And so he's obviously drawing our attention to that kind of mental contradiction, or that psychological contradiction that we wrap ourselves into. And he actually prefaced this topic by saying it's about being gentle to ourselves, right? So you get angry, but then you berate yourself for being angry. Can you see the kind of twist there? So what does he go on to say? So he says, we must, then, have a dislike for our faults, which is peaceable, dispassionate, and firm. For as a judge punishes the guilty much better when he is guided by reason in passing judgment and proceeds in a spirit of tranquility, than when he does so with impetuosity and passion. So if we are being our own judges, we should judge ourselves with peace and tranquility, right? So you see yourself doing something wrong, like sinning in general, and instead of being brutal to ourselves and saying, oh, what a disgusting, wretched piece of filth you are, how dare you, and slamming your own head against a wall to berate yourself for doing that. It's like, no, have calm, peaceful, objective justice about the matter. Okay, you've done that wrong. Don't do that again. Try again next time. Right. Otherwise, if you get yourself into these loops, you're just amplifying the damage to yourself, right? We need a certain level of peace to go through life and see things clearly. And so if we keep disturbing that peace simply because the peace itself is being disturbed, then we're just amplifying the problem. And the same thing applies to worrying as well, so it applies to anger and it applies to worrying. And they stem from being brutal with ourselves, right? Berating ourselves for making those mistakes. We're going to make those mistakes. We're all fallen. We're all going to step up. We're all going to keep making mistakes. But berating ourselves to that degree, again, it's a balance. You can make progress by berating yourself properly, but it's that difference between leadership and tyranny, right? And I think this relates to the balance of anger and wrath as well. Yeah. A leader will be firm but peaceable with his subjects. Yeah. So we have to take that objective, and that's what we're going to do. If you don't, there will be consequences. But let's work with this together to get this done, right? And then if one of his subjects messes up, he's like, "No, you did do wrong, and because of that, I'm going to use my righteous anger to correct that and make an example and apply the discipline." That's what a leader does. Whereas a tyrant will say, "Well, because you've messed up, I'm now going to make you suffer. I'm going to make you suffer hard for the sake of that suffering, just because it pleases me to see you suffer." Yeah. And so if we imagine ourselves being leaders of ourselves in that sense, then we should, again, be firm, apply the discipline when it's needed, and again, use the righteous anger when it occurs to recognize the seriousness of the matter, but make it constructive damage. Yeah. Make it constructive conflict. Don't be tyrants who do destructive conflict, who cause pain and suffering and destruction for its sake and for the pleasure of it in itself. Yeah. Okay, so this advice is now cascading onto new topics, which opens up their practicality a bit more. Um, he's now speaking about how to manage our fear and anxiety in the stations of life. So he says, "Be careful then, and diligent, my Philothea, in all the affairs which you have in your charge, for God, having entrusted them to you, wills you to have a great care of them. But if it be possible, do not be solicitous or anxious about them. That is to say, do not undertake them with disquietude, anxiety, and eagerness." There's another little section which I think really helps pull this together. "Never was work well done which was done with impetuosity and eagerness." Basically, with anxiety, fear, you don't do work well when you do it in a rush, right? And we rush often because we're anxious to some degree. So that's what he said with those two passages. He's basically saying we have our charge and we should do it with the utmost care and diligence because we should do everything that we do well. But don't do it with anxiety and eagerness, because if you do that, then it won't be done well, right? We will slip up, we will stumble. Be patient with the work you have to do and allow that patience to work with a certain level of peace as well. Um, of course, it should go without saying is if you're lacking any of these things like quietude, tranquility, justice, peace, patience, ask for them, right? We should always ask God for the virtues that we lack and that we need. So, but that's the ideal. We have these stations that we must commit to, but we should do them without being anxious about it. We should do our work and our duties with tranquility. Then he also says, "We always do a thing quickly enough when we do it well." Anyone who's ever done any kind of work probably knows that, right? And I've worked in the construction industry enough to know that that's very true. It's better to do a single cut well on a piece of wood than to get it wrong and then to have to cut another piece. And then to get that one wrong and then have to do another piece after that, right? If I had spent the extra 10 or 15 seconds doing the first cut, I wouldn't have wasted the minutes that it takes to do the other cuts, right? So do it well, but do it once. I think we have a phrase, there was a phrase that pipe fitters and carpenters use, which is like measure twice, cut once. Don't measure once and cut twice. "Receive, then, in peace, the affairs which fall to your lot, and try to dispatch them in an orderly manner, one after the other. For if you seek to dispatch them all together, or without order, your efforts will weigh you down and weaken your spirit, and ordinarily you will be crushed down under the burden and will be unable to effect anything." And in all your affairs rely wholly on the providence of God, to which alone all your plans owe their success. Nevertheless, work quite tranquilly on your part to cooperate with it. I should have really separated that into two sections, so let me just speak about that first bit first. Receive all the affairs that fall into your lot. Do them in an orderly manner, one after the other. This is just, again, it's like commonsensical, simple life advice. Prioritize and execute. Don't give yourself 500 things to do and then try to do all 500 things at once. Because at the end of the day, you will split your attention so thin that, if you've got to fill up 500 glasses of water and you try to fill them all up at the same time, then no one's going to have a full drink, right? Whereas if you do one cup at a time, you've got enough for one person, the second for the second, the third for the third, right? It's much more effective and practical. Our tasks are the same way. We should order things properly and do things in the order we need to. It is a skill that needs to be developed by each person, because obviously life doesn't hand us things one thing at a time. It does hand us many things at once. Getting organized and dealing with them is something that we have to learn and develop. We have to learn to strategize and deal with that appropriately, but we should do, because it makes us more effective. And then, of course, he says, in all of these affairs, rely wholly on the providence of God, to which alone all your plans owe their success. Nevertheless, work quite tranquilly on your part to cooperate with it. The acting and living of life is a two-way street. There is a mistake that some people make where they will say that because God is ultimately the source of everything, and because I rely on him and his providence for everything, therefore I'm just going to leave everything to him. It's not quite the right attitude to have. He hands us everything to work with it. He does not want us to be passive. Christianity, Catholicism, is an active religion. It's realized in the living of it, and we do that with God. I don't know whether this quote is 100% accurate, because I saw it in passing, but I think that Joan d'Arc said, God helps those who help themselves, right? The other way to describe it is like his grace, his providence, all of his gifts are like tools that he's handing us, right, to do the good works of our lives with. That's what his providence is providing. That's what's flowing downstream from his providence, of these tools and gifts. And then obviously our inclinations and our actual tasks and stuff as well. So he hands us these tools, and it's up to us to use them properly to do the things that we need to do in life. Obviously, what we shouldn't do is get handed a tool by God, like an axe, to chop down a tree, and then say, well, because it's his providence, you turn then to God and say, well, go on then, chop down the tree. Right? That's obviously nonsensical. It's like, no, I handed you the axe so that you can do that job, but I will give you the axe. I will give you patience so that you can be patient. I will give you strength so that you can be strong. But you need to use those things in your life for it to be proper justice and for it to actually be of value, right? So that's how we should cooperate with providence. We rely on it, yes, but we don't just let it happen. We cooperate with it. And I think for this session, that's a good place to end. So thank you very much for your time.